Okay, we'll call the April, well, wait, what is it exactly? 24th? April 24th meeting of the Santa Barbara City Ordinance Committee to order. Or you just want to call the roll since we're all sitting here, but.
Chair Grant Huff.
Here.
Frank Hotchkiss.
Here.
Randy Rouse.
Here.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Wally, shall we have you take us off from where we were last time? And this is our second meeting on this topic.
Mr. Chair, thank you. Yes, as you know, 2 weeks ago, the Ordinance Committee reviewed a first draft of a possible city ordinance prohibiting the use of plastic bags and requiring a fee on the use of a paper bag by a grocery store, essentially a store that sells food but not prepared food. And as part of that discussion, the committee asked for or directed a few changes be made in the draft ordinance. And the draft you have in your council agenda materials today includes those changes as we understood those. And if we didn't understand anything, maybe we can talk about that today. Just to go through those changes briefly, the main one has to do with how this ordinance would be implemented, the time frame for the implementation. And as I say, this ordinance restricts the use of plastic and paper bags, or regulates the use of plastic and paper bags by stores serving food, selling food. And the first phase of the implementation would be for the larger stores, for stores greater than 10,000 square feet. And that would occur under this draft within 180 days or 6 months of the adoption of the ordinance. The second phase would be a year after adoption, and that would essentially include every store within the city that is a drugstore, pharmacy, supermarket, grocery store, convenience store, any store essentially that sells food, including milk, bread, soda, snack food, that sort of thing. And unless we're missing something, that's pretty much going to be every sort of convenience store, grocery store, drugstore within the city, however small. And as I say, that would be implemented. That would kick in 1 year after the adoption date. And again, the effect would be that they could not use plastic bags, except the type of bag that's defined as a produce bag. I think most of us know what those are. That's a plastic bag that you essentially use within the store to package possibly produce or meat, something like that. And then it doesn't have handles. So it doesn't restrict produce bags, but this ordinance would otherwise prohibit the use of plastic carryout bags and impose a 10-cent fee on paper bags. I know we got a letter from a member of the public that raised what I thought was a good question. And does this ordinance apply to every type of paper bag, every size of paper bag? And I think it's been our assumption as staff that it would, that if you're one of the stores regulated by this ordinance and you issue or use a paper bag with a customer, it wouldn't matter what size the bag would be. Of course, that's the intent behind this ordinance, is to encourage people to go to reusable bags. So we may want to look at clarifying that this ordinance applies to any type of paper bag or any size of paper bag. The other thing that we understood the committee asking us to do had to do with the reporting requirement, and unfortunately I see in this draft we didn't make it clear that this draft is suggesting an annual reporting requirement for the stores. We didn't show the change there correctly. We did look at the section of the ordinance that says what a store may use this 10-cent fee for, and have opted to stick with the exact language that was within was in the LA County ordinance after which this one is modeled, and which withstood a legal challenge. I think I mentioned 2 weeks ago, it is not uncommon in this business to virtually copy the substance of an ordinance that's been validated through litigation. And it's important not to vary from such an ordinance unless you really think it's necessary and unless the lawyers think it would not affect a substantive legal change. And then this is an example where I think it would be appropriate to stick with the LA County language. And I know, for example, we got a letter from the Grocers Association objecting to this language. I personally didn't understand why in particular, but I do recommend we stick with this language. I think that may be it in terms of revisions to this latest draft. As I mentioned, we do have 2 comment letters from members of the public, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have about those letters. I believe Mr. Four also has a presentation for you, a short presentation about the aspects of enforcement of this ordinance. And, oh, that reminds me, one of the things that came up was whether this ordinance would restrict the ability of a store to provide free reusable bags. For example, I think the concern was expressed that maybe a large grocery store chain could afford to subsidize or underwrite the free reusable bags and put the smaller stores at a disadvantage. This draft simply defers that issue to regulations issued by the finance director. And that is something maybe we want to talk through, particularly with Mr. Four. Essentially, on this point, that it's not unusual to have regulations by the department head in charge of enforcing the ordinance to sort of explain the fine details and some aspects that it, in a manner consistent with the ordinance. My reaction to this issue of free bags by large grocery store chains is there's a dilemma there. I mean, one of the things this ordinance, or one of the main things this ordinance is about, is to encourage people to have and use reusable bags. So what is so necessarily bad about free usable bags? And I understand that smaller stores may be concerned that they can't compete with that. I'm not quite sure I see that, that people would be induced to go to a store over and over once they have a certain number of free bags in their possession. But so, as I say, maybe we can talk through that one and decide whether that needs to be addressed in the ordinance. And then finally, as I say, Mr. Four has some remarks he'd like to provide with respect to enforcement of the ordinance.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wiley. Mr. Four?
Good afternoon, Chair House, members of the committee. This is very quick. One of the things that we had committed to bringing back to you today was the budgetary impacts of implementing the ordinance based on what we learned from other jurisdictions. So I just have a couple of, wanted to make sure that we were on the same page in terms of the expectations for the rollout, and that's really what I wanted to bring up today. We, Ms. Carpenter, Cruz Carpenter, and I have spent hours and hours on the phone with varying jurisdictions through the past 6 months or so to really understand their experience putting this type of ordinance into place. And what we learned were that there were a few very critical elements to that. The first was the 2 audiences that need to know about the new regulations. The first is the general public, and the second are the businesses that would be regulated. So what we're recommending, and I've got 2 slides only for you. The first is, these are the anticipated costs for the first year implementation. And so what we're recommending is out of the public education fund of the solid waste fund, or the public education line item of the solid waste fund, that we spend approximately $31,000 on various more mass media and outreach elements. That would include radio, print ads, television spots, and that sort of thing. One of the options here is we are looking at undertaking this as a region with the EIR. This could be a regional buy as well, depending on if we line up the timing correctly with everybody. But you know, one of the premises is if we have a new program that is very much education based, it still will be that we need to educate people to defer the enforcement, right? Or to avoid the enforcement, not just to defer it. The second item that we are looking into is the amount of time. This cost, the $32,000, really represents staff time. The bulk of this is staff time. This is the amount of time that other jurisdictions have told us that they spent talking to the stores that would be regulated, answering the questions like, does this bag meet your standard? Does that bag meet your standard? Is this seal of approval appropriate? Is this a reusable bag? Does my tracking system adequately account for the bags that we're selling? And then the annual reporting that the jurisdiction has to do. It also includes, so it's a wide variety of staff one-on-one related issues. It also includes some funding for things like signage and some point of purchase displays that other jurisdictions said have gone a long way toward gaining the consensus of the regulated community. So if we can tell them that, you know, this is a city ordinance, the city values keeping or the city values its citizens and tourists using reusable bags, then that's why. The third line item is in administration. This really goes at the annual reporting. So and again, this really is staff time. What we intend to do is to create an online format where a jurisdiction could go online and actually fill out and enter all the information electronically, and it'd be automatically sent to environmental services for review. And this also, this also accounts for the time of us reminding stores that are regulated that they need to do this, kind of chasing down the annual reports, and then also the preparation of a final summary report for the decision makers as to how effective this ordinance has been, because I think that's a metric that you'll want from us. The final item, again, in the first year, we don't expect to do much enforcement. In fact, we don't expect to really do any enforcement, and most of the education would be bound up in the business outreach, but we may still have some additional education, like our clerical staff fielding phone calls and things like that. So the total amount that we expect to spend, primarily from personnel time and from information and outreach promotional items, including even some bag purchases to give out to the citizens, would be about $83,690. If we look at the ongoing then, so the years out, we do expect to see quite a bit of savings. The first year that we put this into place, it will obviously be the highest cost. As we get 3 to 5 years out, as businesses, assuming that they don't change or go out of business, or we don't have a heavy new crop of people, we expect to see some efficiencies. As we work with communities longer, we see things get more efficient. So we would expect that our outreach to the businesses would drop to about $10,000 a year. That's of additional trainings and primarily restocking supplies that we mentioned before, like signage and POP displays. We would still recommend that we maintain a smaller budget of about $15,000 a year for the ongoing advertisement, at least for maybe the second and third year out, until this really becomes institutional at the stores. The administrative costs, we're estimating we'd see about a 30% decrease in, and then really the enforcement, that's the unknown. If we do a very good job with the one-on-one, if we have a stable inventory of stores that we work with year over year, I would expect us not to have much by way of enforcement. If there's high turnover or just outright backlash, then we may. So in terms of how we intend to implement this ordinance, we'll absorb this for the first year. We have the funds in the public education line item to take care of this, and then we'll kind of see how it goes. In terms of staffing time, the jurisdictions that we've talked to, and it's been several dozen at this point, are reporting to us that the first year is pretty heavy. It's somewhere between a half and a full-time FTE, depending on the scope. I think it's more on the lower end of the half-time. Lorraine's certainly going to be busy, and I may hire some hourly staff to backfill the task that she normally takes care of. In the following years, if this does end up being a primary element of our overall plan, then we'll build it into our operational budget, similar to how we do with other activities. The only fee that I would propose, and it's for your consideration, would be the exemption application fee for if a store submitted an exemption request and not be regulated. I would propose that we have the annual exemption fee that covers about 1 hour of time just for some administration time. It's if the store really wants to pursue it, then they will, and it's to defray some of our costs just on the administration side. And that's all I have for you.
All right, very good. So let's do quick questions of our staff, and then we'll open it up to public comment. Mr. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Four, we talked about a lot of different costs, and then there's the proposed share of the EIR cost. Where does that get generated, and how do we cover that? And have we got any idea?
And I'm looking at Mr. Wiley, but the EIR cost is something that we have contemplated in terms of a shared cost amongst the participating agencies of Beacon, the Joint Powers Authority, that would spearhead that study, and the other participating agencies that would join on to that effort and use that EIR as the basis for the environmental review for their own eventual ordinances. So it would really be a project that Beacon would solicit the cost for and would develop a cost-sharing methodology that would then be split by the participating jurisdictions. At this point, we don't have the cost from Beacon in terms of what that might likely be.
And my second question was, as you spoke about staff time and educational expenses, what did we expend on the Where's Your Bag program?
Ms. Carpenter? Cruz Carpenter, sorry.
Yes, Chairman House and Councilmember Rouse. I'd have to look into that, but my recollection is that in the kickoff of that program, I think we spent approximately $25,000, and we've been spending about $10,000 a year on following years.
Thank you.
Mr. Hotchkiss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question. Maybe this is more for Mr. Riley. Wiley, we can't put this into effect until we have an EIR. Is that correct?
Yes, basically, we believe that the Supreme Court decision in the Manhattan Beach case indicates that for a city our size, the safest legal course would be to have an EIR before we do it.
So if we seem to be taking the lead on this, unless we get everybody on board and they agree and put money up front, we're going to be footing the bill for the EIR, right? Well, we hope not, but that could be the case.
Mr. Chair, if I could, because I've been involved.
Sure.
The idea is, we'll see whether this works out or not, but the idea is that the commissioning of the EIR, the staff work necessary to work with an EIR consultant would be done by the staff of Beacon. And one of the first tasks that they would do would be, among the Beacon members, develop what would typically be called an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, and sort of a side agreement among Beacon members Number one, do you want to pursue this model bag ordinance concept as a city or a county, as a member of Beacon? And if so, you would sign on to this EIR, and you would be committing to paying your fair share of the EIR costs. And so, one of the ways we do this is on population. Santa Barbara is, a city with, say, 10% of the population of the members participating. We would pay 10% of the cost of the EIR. Mr. Forrest checked out the cost of an EIR and learned that several cities have paid about $30,000 for an EIR, and I think one of the quotes was of $60,000. So the idea here is, and as I say, we'll see if this works out, that Beacon could split a cost of somewhere between $30,000 and $60,000 for an EIR several ways, maybe even 10 ways. And it would cost us $3,000 to $6,000, even if it's double that. We don't believe we're talking about a tremendously significant amount of money, but it would be a general fund expense. It would be a new expense that the city would have to pay for.
So another Beacon entity could say, "Nah, we don't want to participate," and then we'd make up the difference.
Right, but we'd know that going in.
Right.
People would sign off, we'd know how many cities or county have joined into this MOU approach. Of course, one of the things we're looking at here is developing what we're calling the model ordinance, and then the city council would forward that to Beacon and say, we suggest this as a model ordinance for Beacon members. And then I think what Beacon would do is agendize a discussion of who wants to participate in an environmental review of this model ordinance. And of course, you would only want to do that if you're serious about ultimately considering adopting such an ordinance.
Well, you might not even want to do that even if you were serious, because then you don't have to pay for it.
Yeah, the other thing about this being signing on this MOU is you'd have the consultant address any specific issues for your community. I know Carpinteria probably has already done this, but the issues, the environmental issues for a city the size of Carpinteria would be a little bit different from Santa Barbara.
Do we have a timeline on this whole EIR process yet? Probably too early to ask, but.
I don't think we do. I think it's sort of on hold right now, pending the city suggesting a model ordinance.
Since you're talking, there was one thing you said before that the words you used, I think, were that we want to prevent people carrying out groceries in a single-use plastic bag. But would that apply if they brought their own plastic bag in?
The way this ordinance is written, it would not. It only, this regulates the stores,
Right.
not the customer.
Right. Okay, good, great. Should we go over size of plastic bags now, or bags, or do we want to wait? What's your preference, John?
Well, I'd like to get the public to have a chance to comment, but.
Good, let's do that.
Let's get that, and then we can go from there. All right, so I have a couple speaker slips. If anybody, we have a small audience today. If there's anyone here who'd like to speak to us on the subject, you can turn in a speaker slip. We have 2 so far. Let's give John Dixon a chance to come up front here, and then Kathy King will follow. Mr. Dixon, thank you for sending your letter to us by email. We appreciate that.
Dixon, Tri-County Produce. And for the record, I just want to state that I'm still not in support of banning plastic bags. However, if it goes forward, my comments are such that I submitted to you and talked last time. Paper bags, I did actually, you guys can have these. The question I emailed you was, would it be on all bags, from a wine bag to various sizes of bags? Would it be 10 cents for all sizes? So if you want to take those, if you have any, you can have them. And I think it should be on all bags, is I guess what I'm advocating, if there's going to be a charge. My question number 2, which hasn't been covered yet, on the operative date, I'm not sure if that's correct in your final draft, where it talks about J1 and J2 stores, and then it says J3. There is no actual J3, I think, in the second drafts. Okay, so that one's getting corrected. And let's see, the other thing was, a small thing, was I was concerned about the stores being able to give away, the bigger stores being able to give away reusable bags for promotional periods, no charge, that we kind of, a lot of us had discussed in our comments earlier that that should be regulated, whether it's 30 days a year, 60 days a year, and it doesn't seem that there's going to be kind of a ability to do it, but there's not really a time frame being put on that for the big stores. And an important question would be is, down the road, do we have any kind of measurable way of knowing if this ordinance is successful? If we don't see a plastic bag on the beach, we say it was a success? Or, I mean, how do we measure down the road, 2, 3, 5 years, that this was a great idea and a successful thing for our city to be doing? What do we measure it for? And I was kind of wondering what the exemption was for that was just mentioned. I hadn't read about that before, the $60 fee. Would that be just not to apply your annual records, or you could exempt out from that? And that was about it.
Thank you, Mr.
Thanks.
Dixon. Thank you so much. Okay, we'll come up here with Kathy King, and Kathy will be followed by Kira Redmond.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the thoughtful revisions to the ordinance. I just have a couple of tiny little comments. Within the definition of the store, I'm just curious, last time it was discussed how it broke down into which stores would be affected first and then the second tier. And so now that the definition regarding gross annual sales has been removed, I'm just wondering which stores, if you know, which stores will be affected in the first wave based on this new definition. In the second definition on J, I can't read, it's struck there, but the one that starts with a drugstore, pharmacy, supermarket, grocery store, I'm wondering if liquor store should be added there. Last time Mr. Dixon had pointed out that he was concerned that liquor stores that are located near Tri-County Produce be included in there, so I don't know if that needs to be specified. In section 040, I would still like to see some sort of benchmark reduction in bags listed for paper bags, and if it's not met, to increase the amount from 10 cents to 25 cents. Alameda County has this in theirs, and I think it's just a nice way to have a safeguard built in. On D4 there, I know that it's been explained why that language is still in there about how to use the money, and that LA County has successfully defended it once, but they are being appealed on that, and I'm not sure, that they're going to continue to win. So I would rather just see that struck to, make us as defensible as possible by not including how to have the stores spend the money, just for safety purposes. And that's all that I had, so thank
Before
you
you
very
leave,
much.
I have a question. I see Mr. Rouse just clicked on as well. Did you have a question for her? Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. King, so when we talked about the liquor store, and I kind of drifted over to a store, for example, that might sell only fine wines, like maybe the Wine Cask Retail Shop or Wine Hound. And typically, when you buy multiple bottles, you'll put those in
A wine carton, usually.
a wine carton, or sometimes
Or a
they'll put
bag.
them
Yeah.
in if you buy it in your canvas bag, you might put them in some paper sleeves.
Right.
Were those kind of stores to be included in your definition, or?
Well, the definition that I was talking about here was the plastic bags, because last time Mr. Dixon mentioned those little black plastic bags that some liquor stores, not at the level of the Wine Hound or Wine Cask, give out, but just to hold a can of beer or whatnot. So I know that the wine sleeve paper bag is sort of up for discussion.
That's similar, whereas I understood the plastic bag, and I was thinking about
Yeah.
whether or not they're going to be required to charge.
I
for
think
the,
that would come under how you define paper bags. And I know that the California Grocers Association and Mr. Dixon both prefer that those wine sleeves be included in that definition, but ultimately that's up to you.
Thank you.
Okay. And I had a question for you before you take off. You had said about a benchmark having to do with, and this goes a little bit to a question that was raised just a minute ago, and that was, how do we know if it's working?
Right.
And so what did you have in mind? You referenced Alameda's ordinance. What were you considering?
There is a
I've read that, but
there's a section of Alameda's ordinance that says that if there's an uptick in paper bag use, because obviously we don't want that, because those are also energy-intensive product, and you don't want to see those increase in use as a result of the ordinance. So what Alameda County did was say, if there is an uptick in paper bag usage, then we'll raise the fee to 25 cents a bag, which I think is a nice safeguard. Generally, reporting on these ordinances has been 70 to 98% of people bringing reusable bags within a short time of the ordinance taking effect. So I don't know that that's necessarily going to happen in terms of paper bag usage increasing, but I think it's just nice to have a safeguard in there.
Do you have that language with you by some chance?
I do. I have the Alameda ordinance with me.
Would you submit it so we
Sure.
can take a look at it? Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, and then last speaker is Kira Redmond.
Good afternoon, Chair, committee members, Kira Redmond, Santa Barbara Channel Keeper. Thank you for moving forward with this ordinance quickly. I think it's a good one. I just had a couple comments. Like Ms. King just said, we're also concerned about the provision that tells stores how they can spend the money. I just think it's cleaner to leave it out. And I also agree with Ms. King's statement about the increasing the fee if we do see an increase in paper bag use, which we obviously don't want. One other comment was the time lag between the larger stores and the smaller stores of a year, the smaller stores having a year extra to comply. I think that's a little long. 6 months, I think, is what some other cities have done. And finally, I was hoping to get a little clarification on, because I haven't been attending the last few ordinance committee meetings, but the removal in this current draft of the $2 million gross annual retail sales and why that was taken out. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Okay. So it's back to us here on the ordinance committee. Mr. Hotchkiss.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So let's go over the size paper bag again. This bag would be the same as this bag or this one insofar as, although this costs 11 cents and this one costs a lot less, we want to charge the same amount for each?
Mr. Chair, Council Member.
Four.
Excuse me? Oh, yes, the definition of reusable bag does not differentiate on size.
Okay, so the answer to my question is yes, that would be the same charge. Okay. We have a definition in here. The plastic carryout bag is, quote, derived from either petroleum or a biologically based source. Are all other sources that are not named okay, or any other source that's not named okay? You see what I'm talking about?
Definitions
First
on
page,
page 1.
number D, section 1, 9.150.010D, plastic carryout bag.
And so could you repeat your question then?
Now, the question is, if it's not any bag made predominantly of plastic derived from either petroleum or a biologically based source, such as corn or other plant sources, that's covered. But if it were not made from those materials, it would not be covered?
My understanding is that's correct. As
Okay,
written, yes.
that's fine. Where we say that it would be up to the head of the finance department to, what do we say here? I think,
It's on page 5 at the
yeah,
bottom.
page 5, section 9150060 or 070B, if determined to be appropriate, the city finance director may adopt regulations restricting the ability of those stores defined in subparagraphs, blah, 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 to offer customers free usable bags. What's our intent there? I'm just curious about what we're trying to do there.
Mr. Chair, I'll respond to that.
Mr. Wiley.
At the last meeting, the suggestion was that the city regulate how often a store offers free reusable bags, not more than 90 days a year or whatever. Number one, as I said, I'm not sure why that's appropriate, and maybe we can talk about that.
Maybe that
Number
should be
two,
part
how
of it.
we would ever enforce it. You know, it's one thing to enforce this ordinance that bans plastic and requires a 10-cent fee for paper because, in theory at least, a city staff person could spend 5 minutes in a store and know the answer as to whether they're banning plastic and charging a fee for paper. And then we've got annual reporting, and it's a pretty black and white thing they would report. And I imagine a very high percentage of the stores are going to file their reports and be honest about it. But how would we ever track how many days a year they're offering free bags or not?
Right.
You know, it just doesn't strike me as the sort of thing that's very enforceable, and I'm inclined against things that aren't enforceable.
Sure. I understand.
And so I put in here that, well, if we're going to do that, it would be done by regulation of the finance director, and then maybe they could figure out some way. But I think the real point at this point would be, do you feel it's appropriate for the city, for this ordinance, to regulate stores giving away reusable bags?
Right. Well, that paragraph, I think, also left me wondering. I mean, we're giving him carte blanche here. Is that something that council should do? And so far as stores that serve prepared food, if they also sold other things, an extreme example, Sullivan Goss has a restaurant in back. So I don't know if they'd be covered or not, but they could voluntarily cooperate with this program.
Oh, certainly. And I think there will be a fair amount of that once grocery stores, you know, food stores are required to do this. I think our assumption is that a lot of other stores will start doing the same thing.
Okay. Since our aim is to increase the use of, and this is to either you or Mr. Wiley, increase the use of reusable bags, could we not take whatever money is accrued from generated by the ban and actually pay people or give them a discount if they came in with a reusable bag of 5 cents or 10 cents? That's legally feasible, is it not?
It's a new idea.
It is. Sure. I'm trying to give a positive twist to government here. So,
and you know, I know as this has evolved, the question of whether a city could require a tax or a fee, however you want to call it, on paper bags was answered in. I mean, cities felt, well, that's subject to either Prop 218 or Prop 26. That would take a vote of the people if the money came to the city.
right.
So I think LA County was one of the first to do it. They came up with the idea, what we're going to do is have the money go to the stores, and therefore it's not a tax, it's not a fee, doesn't require voter approval under either of these propositions.
Right.
And as you know, the courts have validated that. This idea of a required discount is sort of a knockoff of that latter thing, and I don't know. It might be legal. It might not run afoul of Prop 218 or Prop 26. My inclination, and it's just because I'm conservative about such things, is not to try to something new and different, because generally when you get new and different in this area, somebody files a legal challenge and says, that's, you know.
But we could at least suggest that because it says that part of the use of the money is to promote the use of reusable bags. So that could be, I mean, that certainly fits under that rubric.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, sometime down the line, I think it might be worth suggesting that or considering it. And I think Mr. Dixon is right, and it's sort of in what you're already suggesting, which is we have a review period, maybe give it a chance to work and see what happens in 2 years, come back and say, well, we need to do this, we need to do that. That's just my suggestion to you, gentlemen. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I think Mr. Wiley would agree that enforcement is kind of the bugaboo in a lot of ordinances when it comes to making sure things are effective if they're not. But I think the one thing we have to be responsible for is not to do any harm and not to hurt the little guy by making something that a big retailer could take advantage of and a smaller guy would not be able to compete with. And I was just thinking about even as much as liquor stores, this is going to be a new thing where somebody walks in with a reusable canvas bag to a liquor store where they're not used to having people do that and they're used to washing for shoplifting. And now they're going to probably want to, put out, I guess, carrier baskets and whatnot, and then you could bring like you would at another situation. So, I don't suggest we try to regulate that, but I do suggest we try to level the playing field so the little guys don't get chewed up in this process. I agree with the speakers that have spoken about the section about trying to determine what stores do with these costs. I think it would be much simpler and much safer to have that language not be a part of it. And then in terms of the Ms. Redmond, I think, spoke to the amortization plan of the different things and making it shorter time. Once again, I'm going to have to refer to the actual business people that know what they've had to buy, the amounts they've had to buy, and once this ordinance is triggered, and of course the timeline is a little bit fuzzy, they have to have an appropriate amount of time. A large grocery store may be even able to give their bags or sell their bags to one of their other brother units somewhere else, where of course the little independent would not. So I think we have to give a plenty of a cushion for people to be able to use up their static inventory. And I think the other thing is Mr. Dixon also brought up a thing about what metric do we use to measure this. I assume that the Where's Your Bag plan was claimed as not successful because I think because of the lack of participation or continued participation by certain stores. I suppose that was the measurement. I don't know what we're going to use as a metric to say that whether this was successful or not. I don't know. You certainly could have the use of paper bags, but that may or may not speak to the issue. So I don't know how we revisit this, how we go back to it. That's kind of one of my problems with this. We're talking about spending some money in education, which I think is exactly where we should be doing it. But it would be nice to have an ordinance that had some kind of measurable enforcement metric, so we could say we did this and it worked because, and that just doesn't exist in this case. And that's all I have right now. Thank you.
Okay, very good. So, perhaps there's some blend of that in the suggestion that this is, we would probably include some review at some point where we could look back at it and see how it's been working, which would then sort of force the issue of how do we say it's working. That's your suggestion of coming back in a couple of years would give us a chance to take a look back and see how it's been going. Another suggestion was made from the public was something like what Alameda did, where they actually did say that if there was not a reduction in the use of the paper bags, that it would just especially because of the environmental issue that has come up, that there would be a ramping up to a 25-cent fee instead of 10-cent. But it was established as a benchmark. So those are a couple of suggestions in that area. I think maybe what we might want to do is just it's really short, and there's only a limited number of changes that we're seeing here. Let's just walk through it real quick and then just see how we do on this. The definition of store, and Mr. Wiley, in J1 on page 3, there's the word "and" in there, and "ands" always worry me. A store of at least 10,000 square feet, it goes on, generates sales of use tax pursuant to Bradley Burns, and on and on. Then it says, "and that has a pharmacy licensed."
Here, I think that should be or.
Or,
now.
okay, thank you. All right. And then it seems that the rest of that sentence, in the second one, J2, it talks about including those stores with a Type 20 or 21 license issued by the Department of Alcoholic Beverage Control. Is that a liquor store?
I believe so.
Okay, because that question had come up, whether liquor stores.
We can put liquor store in there. It doesn't hurt.
Okay, unless there's objections.
It says, and you see that we said, or other similar retail entity, and it's not uncommon to have a phrase like that. You're saying, look, we're talking about these kinds of stores, and
maybe liquor store could just get put in there so it's clear, and then that's one of those.
It's just an example of a type of store that you're talking about.
We'll move over to the next page on 4, regulation of recyclable paper carry-out bags, and there were the changes. This is the 040 and then D, and this has to do with what they actually use it. Now, you've been coming back to us pretty clearly that you want to stay close to the LA ordinance language, and I'm hearing differing opinions here and also from the public. It seems to me like we might just avoid the issue altogether. Can you just speak to that? You've heard a couple of different opinions here from us. Is there any real downside from leaving it out?
Yeah, my legal recommendation, no one has explained, and as far as I know, they're non-lawyers, why it helps to leave it out, because the Superior Court in L.A. focused on this language in validating the ordinance. So my legal recommendation is to leave it in.
Okay.
But if you
Is
want
there-
to
is
follow
there
their
s-
recommendation.
Is there a severability clause of some sort in these kinds of
Yes, there
ordinances?
is.
So if this were struck down, it wouldn't invalidate the whole ordinance. It would.
Well, this wouldn't be struck down. It's not really a substantive provision. But anyway, municipal code does have a severability. I'm not sure the answer's clear-cut about severability. You never know on something like that.
I think that's an important one, I think, for me in a way, because if we, and I take your advice, thank you, that if there is a part of this that wasn't the absolute operant piece of the whole thing, that were to be still in dispute out there somehow, would that invalidate the entire ordinance? And that's a kind of a generalized question I have for you.
And I just can't say. It would depend on how the judge views it.
I see.
Whether this was some sort of, the ordinance could survive with this part of it stricken, but it just really wouldn't make sense to strike this part of an ordinance when the real operative provisions is the 10-cent fee.
Okay.
I mean, this was what was challenged in L.A. County and was what was validated in L.A. County. So to say that something's on appeal means we should take it out doesn't make any sense at all.
As I'm going through here, I'm hoping to hear from either of the or
Mr.
both
Chair,
of you.
can I interject one
please,
thing?
Mr.
As long as we're on this section on the definition of store, and Mr. Wiley, I think we may want to keep the word "and" there on the pharmacy, because if we say "or," I think that opens us up to any store, regardless of what they vend or their type.
Well, I think we need to look at that. I'm realizing
Okay.
that in striking one, we lost the reference to the sale of dry goods, canned goods, that sort of
Right.
thing. And so
Okay.
we may need to look at that again. What I understood the committee to say is we want stores selling food, the first phase to be stores greater than 10,000 square feet which are selling food. And, or if they have a in-house pharmacy, because that would typically be the larger pharmacies. But that's.
And we do have supermarkets that are large that don't necessarily have a pharmacy in them.
Right. So it would be or, not and.
Mr. Four?
And the others, this is just a suggestion. And again, I haven't really spoken to you about it in a couple weeks, but there was the suggestion by the finance director that we include the language on the $2 million sales as reported by the store. Is that
Well, we're striking the gross sales.
okay?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. Okay.
Based on a discussion last time, we left it where we were going to focus on the size of the store by square feet and do it in the two phases, which is J1 and J2 here now. Renamed. Okay, please go chime in. I'm going to keep walking through this, so I'm listening.
Well, I thought we had a $2 million gross in there somewhere too. Where did that go?
That left at the last meeting.
I don't think we agreed that should leave. I certainly didn't.
Maybe.
What was your recollection?
No, we decided because it was with the profile of the stores in town, I think it was easier for staff to just go by square footage as
I
opposed
see.
to
All
volume.
right.
Okay, yes, Mr. Rouse, please.
Back to Mr. Wiley, and I'm concerned about the point that Mr. Ford and Mr. House brought up about the language in J1. And so, because my concern is, staff and the intention of this was so far to say not regulate bads used by, the ordinance does not regulate bads used by restaurants, fast food establishments, and other retailers which sell no food items such as department clothing stores. But by taking out the and putting in or, do you not then necessarily include the part that staff said we excluded?
I think what we need to have is a store of at least 10,000 square feet, et cetera, which sells a line of dry goods, canned goods, or non-food items, and some perishable items, or which has a pharmacy. Or we could just stop it after food, 10,000 square foot in food, and leave pharmacies out of it.
Okay, so to change that,
Yeah.
bring in some of
We've
what
got
we
to-
struck.
We didn't realize or focus on the fact that by striking one in its reference to food, we've deleted a critical element of this, that it was grocery stores.
Let me check in here for a second. Going back to the discussion we had at City Council, and it got it here, the ordinance would apply to supermarkets, pharmacies, retail stores, and convenience stores of a certain size or sales volume as determined above. We were not, this was not limited only to supermarkets and food stores
Right, we always included, we have so far included pharmacies.
and retail stores.
No, not unless they serve food or sell food. I mean, I did watch the ordinance committee meeting online a couple times to try to make sure I understood what the consensus was.
No, I think you're correct. We go by what the guides were in the staff report here, saying the draft ordinance does not regulate bags used by restaurants, fast food establishments, or other retailers which sell no food items, such as department and clothing stores. That was the understanding, and that's the way the ordinance should read.
Yeah, we'll keep the narrow focus for now. Let's move on to the next thing. As we go through, is there any other discussion on things that we've just talked about so far? So this business about the uses of the 10 cents, that would be left in there based on our...
Yeah, I would just like to get something in there that gives them the idea if they wanted to use it to pay somebody to actually bring in a reusable bag, that would be great. That's sort of positive government as opposed to negative government.
Educational materials, educational campaign, cost of providing reusable bags, actual cost of providing the recyclable paper carry-out bags, and costs associated with complying with the requirements of this chapter. It's pretty broadly laid out there. Doesn't that include your... What am I missing there, Mr. Hodges?
Well, it came as a surprise to everybody in the room, so I think we are missing something. We need to get it in there somewhere.
Then say it again so we can...
Yeah, that these funds could be used, and we're not telling them they have to, but could be used to actually give a discount to somebody who brought in a reusable bag. Personally, I think that would have a much more dramatic effect on use of reusable bags, even though it's a dime. Big deal. But it's just moving in the right direction.
You know, if I might, Mr. Chair, Mr. Wiley brought up the thing before about a model ordinance as far as getting our other jurisdictions to chime in with us that want to support this and share the EIR and the costs and whatnot. And the more complex and more inclusive we make this ordinance, the less broad we make it. I think that the harder it's going to be, or the more other jurisdictions might want to parse it. I think if we go as drafted with the recommended adding in the definition the one and the part of struck 1 and 2 that Mr. Wiley talked about earlier, we might have an ordinance that is enough of a model ordinance for other jurisdictions to move forward on more quickly, and we might have a better shot at getting this done quicker.
Well, I think Mr. Wiley said that everybody's going to do their own tweaking, and that's for sure.
Including the city of Santa Barbara when it's all said and done.
Right.
Understood, but we're talking about trying to initiate Beacon's efforts at the EIR. You know, it seems to me that the more complex we make, the more specialized we make an ordinance, the less able we're going to be able to move forward as a region.
Hold on, Mr. Hodges, just let me just settle this a little bit. As we move forward, I'm in favor of retaining the language that we have here right now. So at least as we move this for something that we're going to put forward at the end of the day, I feel we've got a couple of votes that really keep it with the language that Mr. Wiley has suggested. I think there may be a place at the end of the day for us to include that kind of language when it comes back around, but I really buy this line of reasoning by Mr. Rouse that we really are, at this point, formulating a model ordinance that will go forth for environmental review by the jurisdictions under Beacon.
Should we move various sections like that?
We can. With this, I think we could just take a vote on that particular thing and do that. But I was going to try to see how much consensus we have on all this. Let's come back to this one in just a second. Then we have the reporting on a quarterly, annual, and quarterly and monthly basis. But that's up to the finance director, right, Mr. Wiley, on that next item, E?
Oh, no, I'm sorry, we were suggesting that be annual.
Annual.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we just didn't.
Any
we
issues?
should have only underlined the annual.
All right. So we're doing, and then the next change from the last time we were here was at the bottom of 5. That's That's the authority for the city finance director to possibly in the future to adopt regulations restricting the ability of those stores to find in the subparagraphs J1 and J2 to offer customers free reusable bags as a promotional item. That doesn't make a prohibition of any sort, but it leaves it up to the finance director's discretion. Comments?
Well, once again, I'm going back to Mr. Dixon's comments as a small independent and kind of the fear of being outcompeted by these other larger stores. I don't know how much of a real practical thing that's going to be, but it's certainly at least we should put something in the language, or not in the ordinance language, or at least in the educational materials about, trying not to. I don't know. I don't know how to approach that. I just don't want to make this an unlevel playing field between the big guys and the little guys.
Okay, we're not resolving it with this ordinance. We're leaving it up to the finance director, along with the reporting requirement that the finance director would be dealing with it.
Right.
So a little ambivalence on that, but it's something perhaps could be included without any great issue. And then the last piece is the operant dates. This is a 6-month for 10,000. Let's see, how is it? For J1 stores, it would be 6 months after the effective date of the ordinance. And for the J2, the smaller ones, it would be 1 year after the effective date of the ordinance. Any issues with those? Okay. Now, we had a couple other things here. We'll come back to that one issue in just a minute. Reporting requirements, we know that we'll be hearing back on an annual basis to the finance director. We've had a question about metrics and how that's measured. Mr. Ford, do you have suggestions with regards to what we're going to use in terms of evaluating the program?
Mr. Chair, I think one of the primary metrics will be the information that the stores will submit to the city on an annual basis. I think we will know the inventory of stores that are no longer distributing single-use plastic bags. You will have information on the number of single-use bags that were distributed for a fee. If you see trends downward on that would be telling. Assuming that consumerisms remained constant and you saw a downward trend in the use of bags, I think that may inform your decision. You will have some information to evaluate even at the end of the first year. From that, we may then develop some metrics that you may want to key into for the future years.
Okay. And then we had a suggestion of some sort of formal review after a couple of years. Any issues with that with regards to
No, we intend to. Staff intends to give you a summary every year of
annual
how
report.
It's going.
Okay, very good. All right, then.
That's a little different than saying have a formal review by council in 2 years. It's not, because just a report is not actionable, but an actual review by council is.
Absolutely. We staff intended to give you the report that you could use in your review.
Okay, so annual reporting. All right, that's good. Then let's go to, all right, we talked about that language from LA County. Time frame enforceable, let's see, a measurable way. This exemption, $60 fee, I didn't catch, where is that in here? I didn't understand that.
Mr. Chair, I would disregard that in the current format, and now that I read it, the regulations are clear, and I think we can just strike that.
Which is where, please? Where is that in?
Mr. Chair, the only exemption is for those customers that are in the WIC program or another program.
Mm-hmm.
So there is no way to exempt a store that's covered by this ordinance.
Thank you. Okay, so we got the definition of the store part worked out, how the store spends the money, and the review period. Okay, and then the only other piece was a benchmark. I think what we're seeing here, and from your suggestions, Mr. Four, that with those reviews, we would have the opportunity then, if we feel like it's failing miserably on the paper bag side, the council could revisit that and up the ante. So, okay, and all right.
Chair, on that last point, lately the council has formalized that review, and that's what I understood the suggestion was, and we would, if you want to do that, we'll put a uncodified section in the ordinance that saying this ordinance shall be returned to the council for council review. I understood like 2 years. What Mr. Ford was suggesting was that there'd be some sort of status report to the council every year. That sounds like overkill to me. And if you don't put it in an ordinance, people lose track of it. And so we promised the ordinance committee in April of 2012 a status report, and if it's not formalized somewhere, I promise you people will forget about it in a few years. So.
Do we do, with new ordinances, do we do, after the first 2 years, we have it comes back to council for a review, and then that would be, that way we're not having to redo this every single couple years?
I mean, the council can do anything it wants, but lately, when you've asked for something like that, we put it in the ordinance. This ordinance shall be returned for council review within 2 years of its effective date. So.
Okay, very good.
And, we do have the metric of the annual reports telling us how many paper bags have been used. And that sort of gets to a point people have been making about reconsidering whether the fee should go up or whether the ordinance should be reconsidered or not.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Rouse, and we're just about to wrap this up. So.
Right, Mr. Chair, if I may, could I get you, Mr. Wiley, then to, as best you can, do J1 for me in the the revised form, please?
Actually, I might want to just walk through what I've heard. Just on page 2 in the definition of a recyclable paper carryout bag.
No, for referring on page 3.
I know, but I was going to refer
Wiley's going to walk us through some things. I'm done with the list I had here. Mr. Wiley, go ahead.
Yeah,
please.
just so in the definition of a recyclable paper carryout bag, I think it should say a paper bag, parenthetical, of any size. Just so we're clear, it's all paper bags. So that's one change. Then you get to page 3, J1. It would be a store of at least 10,000 square feet of retail space, et cetera, all the way down to the words taxation code, where we would insert the language, which sells a line of dry goods, canned goods, or non-food items and some perishable items, or which has a pharmacy license pursuant to Chapter 9. So that would be food stores of 10,000 square feet or greater, or stores that have a pharmacy license. J2 would stay the same unless you want to add liquor store as an example of the type of store.
I think there was interest in doing that. Just as an example. Okay.
And I mean, your typical liquor store sells snack food and things like, so they're going to be covered anyway, but couldn't hurt. Then moving to page 4, just make it clear that the reporting requirement is annual. And then correcting the last section, that now there's only J1 and J2. And then adding an uncodified provision that this ordinance would be returned to the City Council 2 years after its effective date for City Council review.
Good. And I think that settles it. We just wanted to take a decision on 040D, and just at least at this level we could see where we stand. So there's 3 of us here. Can I have a motion just to accept this one piece, and then we'll take the thing as a whole?
Which piece is that?
This is on page 4, and this is yeah, this is the one about what the money's used for. And I know we may have a difference of opinion on that item, but we may, for the whole thing, be able to come forward with something we could send to council as a whole. So can I have a motion for the language?
Mr. Chair, move the city attorney's recommendations on 040D.
Okay, I'll second that for the discussion. And is there any more discussion on that, Mr. Hotchkiss? Okay, all those in favor of that, say aye.
Aye.
Aye?
No.
No. Okay. So now let's take a look at the entire package that includes the changes that Mr. Wiley just enumerated. And this is a recommendation for it to go to City Council for consideration to be submitted to Beacon and to move forward as has been described by in the council's.
May I ask Mr. Wiley one question? Mr. Wiley, as with the suggestions and revisions you made, do you think that that clearly states in the ordinance itself the exceptions that we talked about with retailers, et cetera, as are delineated on page, what's the notes, the staff report?
It's Jay.
I believe so.
Okay.
Again, what we would be regulating would be initially stores of 10,000 square feet or greater that sell food, or we have a pharmacy, and then 6 months after that, basically all stores that sell food. Wouldn't regulate restaurants, fast food establishments,
Retail.
department stores, clothing stores, any store that didn't sell food.
Hardware?
Hardware, no.
No, okay.
Okay, very good. So let's, I'm going to entertain a motion to pass this with those amendments on to City Council.
Okay, Mr. Chair, I move that we pass the ordinance in the spoken amendments we've created and in total.
Second.
All right, any other discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. And there's no opposed. Thank you all very much. Thanks to everyone from the public who came and who wrote to us. We really appreciate that. We are adjourned.